All right, welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right into this, because today we are unpacking a truly fascinating and, honestly, rapidly shifting geopolitical story. We are looking at the massive evolution of South America's most powerful criminal syndicate, the Primeiro Comando de Capital, or, as it's commonly known, the PCC. We're going to trace exactly how a local prison gang leveled up into a global corporate empire and why the U.S. government has made the highly controversial move to designate them as a foreign terrorist organization. The single designation is causing some serious geopolitical friction, and by the end of this explainer, you're going to understand exactly why this matters so much for the future of international law and global security.
So, to really wrap your head around this scale we're dealing with here, just think about this number, 100,000. According to recent intelligence, the PCC commands a workforce of roughly 40,000 lifetime, completely baptized members, and that's supported by an additional 60,000 contractors. It absolutely puts their sheer power into perspective, right? We're not talking about a local street gang here. This is Latin America's largest and most sophisticated drug syndicate. It's an organization with the manpower of a small nation's military, operating across borders, oceans, you name it.
Section 1. Brazil's biggest syndicate, Brazil's underworld.
Now, the PCC definitely didn't start out in some high-rise boardroom. They were founded back in 1993 by just 8 inmates locked up in a maximum security prison in São Paulo, and originally they were just demanding better prison conditions. Fast forward to 2006, and they had grown powerful enough to coordinate this massive 4-day wave of attacks across São Paulo that tragically resulted in 564 deaths. But here's the thing. That bloodshed actually taught the PCC leadership a crucial lesson. They realized that extreme violence brings extreme state repression, which at the end of the day is just bad for business. So they adapted. By 2014, they made this massive strategic pivot, completely away from violent local turf wars and focused entirely on the insanely lucrative international drug export market. And making a pivot like that, well, it required a totally new way of doing business.
Section 2. A corporate criminal empire, syntones and structure.
It's wild, but the PCC operates way less like a traditional cartel and much more like a franchised Fortune 500 company. Literally. They are organized into these highly specialized departments called sintonias. Let's break them down real quick. Up at the very top, you have the Sintonia Geral Final, which is the supreme leadership. And crazy enough, they mostly operate from inside federal prisons. Right below them is the Sintonia Financeira, handling all the complex accounting and heavy-duty money laundering. Then, you've got the Sintonia Restricta, which is basically their own internal intelligence agency. They use end-to-end encrypted apps to map out routes and even coordinate targeted assassinations. And finally, the Sintonia dos Gravatas, or the Sintonia of the Ties. This is a massive network of lawyers providing legal cover. I mean, they even have a registration department that legitimately collects union dues from its members.
And look, this corporate structure pays off massively. State authorities estimate their minimum annual revenue is a staggering $909 million, nearly $1 billion a year. And that cash doesn't just sit around in duffel bags. The PCC has deeply embedded itself into the legal economy. They control billions in real estate, public transport networks, and they're even using online sports betting in Portuguese football clubs to clean their money.
Section 3. Going global. Global expansion. They also realized pretty quickly that they didn't need to conquer the globe totally solo. Instead, they formed some incredibly brilliant, pragmatic alliances. Over in Europe, they partnered up with the Italian 'Ndrangheta Mafia. The deal is simple. The PCC handles the cocaine supply coming out of South America, and the 'Ndrangheta distributes it across the European market. On top of that, intelligence reports show they've built actual commercial relationships with Hezbollah down in the triple frontier of South America. There, they cooperate on things like arms trafficking and extremely sophisticated money laundering schemes.
But hey, to feed a global network like that, you absolutely need top-tier logistics. Enter the Port of Santos. The PCC essentially secured control over the largest port in South America. Today, that single gateway supplies over 50% of all of Brazil's drug exports heading to Europe and Africa. They even hire specialized deep-water divers to literally attach drugs to the outside hulls of massive cargo ships bound for places as far away as Australia and Singapore. But of course, when you build a criminal empire of this magnitude, you inevitably draw the attention of global superpowers. And that brings us to a major turning point.
Section 4. The terrorist designation, U.S. designation.
All right, so here's where the story takes a massive geopolitical turn. The United States government has officially moved to designate the PCC, along with another group called Comando Vermelho, as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, this is causing some intense friction between the U.S. and Brazil. Let's look at both sides impartially. The U.S. argues this is strictly a national security issue.
It's about aggressively disrupting the revenue streams of what they are now calling narco-terrorists to keep drugs off American streets. The Brazilian government, though, they argue this designation actually gets in the way of law enforcement. Brazilian prosecutors are warning that treating the PCC as literal terrorists raises security clearance levels, which moves intelligence sharing away from standard agencies like the DEA or FBI and hands it over to the CIA. And that creates some massive bureaucratic headaches.
To really understand the U.S. position here, listen to the words of U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He stated, "The Trump administration will continue to use all available tools, keeping illicit drugs off our streets and disrupting the revenue streams funding violent narco-terrorists." So, for the U.S., this is a very clear-cut strategy. They want to dismantle a massive transnational threat by bringing their heaviest diplomatic and economic tools to the table.
On the flip side, we have the perspective of Brazil's current left-wing government under President Lula. Celso Amorim, a special advisor, framed it like this: organized crime is an evil that must be fought, but pretext for intervention is unacceptable. That right there highlights a really deep concern over national sovereignty. The current Brazilian administration views this terrorist label not as a helpful tool for cops, but as potential political interference and a pretty big pretext for foreign overreach inside their own borders.
And we have to mention, domestic politics inside Brazil are completely polarized over this exact issue. Take Senator Flávio Bolsonaro, who represents the Brazilian right-wing perspective. He actually traveled to Washington specifically to lobby for this terrorist designation. His take was, Lula was on his knees to Trump to lobby for CV and PCC, and I was there to work so they can be treated as terrorists, which is what they are. So you can clearly see how an international legal classification is simultaneously being used as a massive wedge issue in domestic Brazilian politics. But really, why is the Brazilian government so anxious about a simple label?
Section 5. Geopolitics and International Law. International Impacts.
Well, that anxiety stems from some very specific legal vocabulary, primarily something called the unwilling or unable doctrine. This is a highly controversial theory in international law. Basically, it argues that if a host country, in this case Brazil, is either unwilling or unable to neutralize a recognized terrorist threat inside its own borders, a foreign state like the U.S. could potentially claim the legal right to use armed force in self-defense right there on Brazilian soil. So for Brazil, slapping the terrorist label on a cartel feels an awful lot like the very first step toward foreign military intervention.
And this brings up an absolutely crucial debate among UN experts and legal scholars about how we define these things. Traditionally speaking, organized crime is driven by profit and market control. The PCC just wants to make money. They aren't trying to overthrow the capitalist system anymore. Terrorism, on the other hand, legally requires violence to be driven by political ideology, xenophobia, or religious motives. So a lot of experts are arguing that calling a profit-seeking corporate drug cartel a terrorist organization is just conflating two totally different legal regimes, which honestly might end up making both of them harder to fight.
But make no mistake, the real-world consequences of this designation are incredibly tangible. Once a group is labeled an FTO, the PCSA faces severe asset freezes. It literally becomes a crime for anyone to even unknowingly do business with them. It triggers heavy global travel restrictions, massive domestic U.S. criminal indictments, and yes, the genuine potential for military force. Keep in mind, we've actually seen the U.S. utilize this exact justification before in the Caribbean, with Operation Southern Spear, launching deadly boat strikes against alleged narco-terrorists. So the stakes we're talking about here are incredibly high.
Which leaves us with a pretty vital question to ponder as we wrap this up. At what exact point does a criminal cartel actually become a foreign terrorist organization? Is it based on their body count? Is it their insane wealth? Their international reach? Or is this label simply a geopolitical tool used by powerful states to expand their own jurisdiction? Understanding the PCC today is no longer just about understanding organized crime. It's about understanding the rapidly shifting boundaries of international law and global sovereignty. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the labels and keep learning.